This is the RTX 5080, and this is officially the hardest I've ever worked on a GPU review. In fact, it's also the most complicated GPU review I've ever had to do for a variety of reasons. As you know, the RTX 5080 was supposed to launch January the 30th, 2025 for a US MSRP of $1,000. However, as you also know, that's not exactly how things went down. Look, my job right now is incredibly hard because I have to review a product that's not really available to buy due to low stock and inventory levels. And when it is available to buy, well, the price isn't exactly what gamers want. And to top it all off, there's a really good chance the person watching this is already upset, angry, or jaded at this entire GPU fiasco. And honestly, I get it. I don't blame you. It really is bad out there, but that kind of puts me at a disadvantage. I feel like I'm standing in front of a village full of people with pitchforks ready to attack me or something. So please, just a little bit of patience and grace and allow me time to do what I do here and go through and break down the card. And now the best thing I can do is objectively review this card, break down what it's capable of doing, provide you with the pros and cons, and let you know what you're getting if you decide to pick up the ROG Astral 5080. Yes, Asus sent this card over to me for review. However, all thoughts and opinions are my own. With that in mind, allow me time to break down the structure of this video and what you can expect. First of all, I have taken the time to add chapters to this video for your convenience. You are welcome to skip ahead and move around to the section that is most interesting to you. Next up, we're going to break down all the hardware used for all the testing today. And then after that, I will break down the specifications of the 5080 and the ROG Astral specifically. From there, we'll move into the dual BIOS on the card and talk about the impact that has on the card itself. Next up is power consumption and temperature testing. And this section will include a breakdown around that fourth fan. I know there were some concerns around that, so I did some extra testing around that. This section will also include the Tower 300 temperature testing as well. And I will also talk about GPU Tweak 3 and what Asus is doing to try and mitigate the melting adapter situation. And then from there, we'll move into some synthetic benchmarks. After that, we'll move over and briefly talk about multi-frame generation, which is new to this series of GPUs from Nvidia. After that, we're going to talk about overclocking support on the ROG Astral. And then finally, we will finish up with the official benchmarks for this card. They will include native 1440p, just pure rasterization, 1440p with ray tracing, native 4K pure rasterization, and 4K with ray tracing as well. Outside of that, there's no additional frame generation or DLSS testing in this video. Finally, we will finish up with pricing and my overall final thoughts. Now, like I said at the start of the video, this is the hardest I've ever worked on a GPU review. I really took my time and I tested as much as I possibly could within my skill set. And so this will be a longer video with a lot of benchmark data. With that being said, I hope you appreciate it. If so, let me know by leaving a comment, hitting the like button, and if you're new, getting subscribed. Let's get into it. Okay, time to talk about all the hardware used. For the motherboard, we have the ROG Strix B850-A gaming Wi-Fi. For the CPU, we have the AMD Ryzen 9800X3D. For the GPU, we are using two different GPUs. Obviously, we have the Asus ROG Astral RTX 5080, and we will be comparing that to the Gigabyte Windforce V2 RTX 4080 Super. I understand the 5080 is best compared to a 4080, but I couldn't get my hands on a 4080 for this testing. For the RAM, I'm using a 32 gigabyte kit of DDR5 Patriot Viper gaming memory, clocked at 6400 MTs. And for the power supply, I'm using an Asus TUF Gaming 1000 watt 80 plus gold PSU. And this is the latest version from Asus, which is ATX 3.1. Asus did send this out along with the GPU for testing. And finally, for the CPU cooler, I am using the Cooler Master 360 Atmos, and all of this hardware was set up on an open air test bench. It may not look the greatest, but it absolutely works. And I made sure I wasn't sharing any lanes on the motherboard. Here's a screenshot from GPU-Z showing you the RTX 5080 running at PCIe 5.0 by 16. And for the operating system, we're using Windows 11 Pro, and the version is 24H2. And finally, for the GPU driver, I am using version 572.16. And now let's start talking about the specifications of the RTX 5080 and the ROG Astral specifically. Now, the challenge here is that there are two sides to this equation. On one side, you have the Nvidia specifications, and on the other side, you have the AIC or add-in card partner specifications, which in this case is Asus. Now, for the most part, the core specifications from Nvidia will be the foundation and mostly be the same for all 5080s across the board. There are a few exceptions. For example, 16 gigabytes of VRAM will be the standard for all 5080s. That's not going to change. However, Nvidia does allow for the add-in card partners to make a few changes here and there, such as power draw, power delivery, and clock speed and things of that nature. And I have to cover the things that Asus has added to the 5080 in order to try and add extra value or performance enhancing features. It's important to understand those things for two reasons. Number one, if you buy this card, those are the things you're paying for. And number two, a lot of these claims from Asus relate directly to my testing. And so I'm not trying to hit you with a bunch of marketing claims or what some people refer to as marketing gibberish in my previous video. These are things that are actually relevant to the review, again, because that's what you're paying for, and also because it does relate directly to my testing. And now for the Nvidia side of the equation, here are the core specifications. The RTX 5080 has 10,752 CUDA cores. It's using 5th generation Tensor cores with 1,801 AI tops. It's using 4th generation ray tracing cores with 171 tops. The base clock speed is 2.3 gigahertz with a boost clock speed of 2.62 gigahertz. It has 16 gigabytes of GDDR7 VRAM, a 256-bit memory bus, and a TGP of 360 watts. And right next to it, you can see the same specs for the 4080 Super and 4080. I will not cover those, but they are there for your reference. And now let's switch over and talk about the ROG Astral specifications. So the official specification for the ROG Astral is advertised as a base clock of 2.76 gigahertz with a boost clock of 2.79 gigahertz. However, I can assure you this card clocks a lot higher than that. It also has a dual BIOS for a performance mode and a quiet mode, and those two options do impact the overall clock speed as well as the thermals and the noise levels of the GPU. The Astral has 3 DisplayPort 2.1 ports and 2 HDMI 2.1 ports. No, that is not standard on all the 5080s. There are several 5080s that do only offer 1 HDMI 2.1 port. It is worth noting that the ROG Astral is a very large card. It is a 4-slot GPU. I will have the dimensions of the card listed on the screen for your reference. Now, some of the main features that Asus is advertising for the ROG Astral are as follows. Number one, it has a unibody design that is pretty much all metal. It is a clean finish, and it does go through a special machining process in order to achieve this design. It obviously has 4 fans, 3 in the front, 1 in the back. The 3 in the front are used as intake, and the 1 in the back is used as exhaust. Arguably, the biggest feature that Asus is offering with the ROG Astral is their per-pin amp sensing technology. This is a feature in the GPU Tweak 3 software that allows you to see all the individual pins in your 12-volt high-power connector, which is incredibly important with all the melting issues going on. The ROG Astral has 50 amp MOSFETs, which Asus claims will allow for 25% more headroom on the power delivery, and because of that, the ROG Astral is not coming out the box at 360 watts like other 5080s. Rather, it comes out the box in performance mode, which will go all the way up to 400 watts when under 100% load. And in terms of thermals, you should set your expectations high, not only because the card is very large and has 4 fans, but also because Asus is claiming they have a new patented vapor chamber design that is directly attributed to keeping the temperatures lower. In addition to that, they also have a phase change GPU thermal pad, which is supposed to also help with lower temperatures and more consistent temperatures. And if that wasn't enough, Asus is also claiming to have an exclusive manufacturing technique called max contact heat spreader. Asus is claiming that it will increase the surface area of the GPU heat spreader by a total of 5%, which Asus claims should result in a temperature reduction of up to 2C. The ROG Astral is marketed to have something called GPU guard, which is essentially 4 mounting points around the GPU die. Asus claims this will help the GPU not to crack or fall out or shift around. And see, this is what I was trying to say earlier. For a lot of you, this comes across as marketing gibberish and you get annoyed whenever I cover it, but this translates to things that you can actually test. Asus has a lot of claims about this, and this all can lower the temperature. So that means it should perform very well from a thermal standpoint. And now we can put that to the test with synthetic benchmarks, gaming benchmarks, and of course by shoving it into a case like the Tower 300 and seeing how well it performs. But first, let's take a look at the dual BIOS. As noted before, the ROG Astral has a dual BIOS. It has a Q mode that stands for quiet mode, and it has a P mode that stands for performance mode. Asus has made the following claims related to the dual BIOS. They claim the performance mode will run 23% colder than the quiet quiet mode, and the performance mode will draw up to 400 watts, while the quiet mode will draw up to 360 watts. Asus claims from their own testing that the performance mode will come in around 51.5 dB, while the quiet mode will come in around 33 dB. Now later in the video, there is a section where we talk about the fourth fan on the GPU, and in that section, I attempt to do my own decibel reading, and I'll explain more about that when we get there. But once we do that, you can then compare Asus's claims to my findings, and I just want to make it clear, keep in mind, every environment is different. Decibel levels may vary from environment to environment. And of course, you have to consider the instruments used to measure the decibels. So keep that in mind. But right now, what we're about to do is we're going to look at synthetic benchmarks and gaming benchmarks and how they compare with the performance mode and the quiet mode and see what the differences are. Okay, the first test we have here is FurMark with the ROG Astral 5080, and I do have it in quiet mode. And as you can see, we're hitting right around 65C, and we are pulling in about 360 watts, exactly like Asus claimed. And if we zoom in on that fan speed in GPU Tweak 3, we can see it's maxing out around 740 RPM, but usually hovers below that. And now we're back in FurMark. This time I have the 5080 in performance mode, and as you can see, we're maxing out around 62C, and we are pulling in 400 watts, exactly like Asus claimed. If we zoom in on GPU Tweak 3 and take a look at that fan speed, we can see it's coming in just under 1700 RPM. And now we have Call of Duty Black Ops 6 with the built-in benchmark running at 4K. On the left, we have the quiet mode, and on the right, we have the performance mode. And as you can see, the final average is only 1 FPS apart, 108 versus 109. It's basically the same. And if you watch the run, you can see pretty much all the GPU stats are pulling in exactly the same. The clock speed's about the same, the temperature's about the same, the GPU utilization's about the same, the power draw's about the same, and the frame rate's about the same. As we get closer to the benchmark run, the performance mode starts to pull ahead a little bit, but overall the final average is only 1 FPS apart, and at 1440p it is 3 FPS faster. Now we're getting ready to go into the section that's called power and temperature, even though we just kind of talked about power and temperature a little bit, but we're going to go a little bit deeper and do some other tests. But first, I do want to talk about this dual BIOS section and what we just saw. So in the synthetic test for FurMark, we basically saw all of Asus's claims live up to what they said. The performance mode did pull in 400 watts. The quiet mode did pull in 360 watts. The performance mode did run colder, and the quiet mode did run quieter with a noticeable lower RPM on the fan speed. Now, unfortunately, none of this really translated over to the Call of Duty benchmark. Yes, the performance mode was still technically a little bit faster in both 1440p and 4K, but not really by a large margin. You could really say these were more or less the same, and it really didn't matter which setting you chose here. And there could be a lot of reasons for that. You know, number one, it's a one game sample size. Number two, it's Call of Duty of all things, which isn't exactly known for being the most optimized game these days. And then number three, as you can see in the benchmark, we were not getting 100% GPU utilization. And so obviously that's not going to hit the GPU the same way a synthetic benchmark will. So there's a lot of factors there, but I wanted to add it in just as a here you go, FYI, but we do have more tests to talk about. Now, one more thing, if you're wondering what that on-screen display was there, that is actually from GPU Tweak 3, and you will continue to see that a little bit more here in this video. However, you will also see an on-screen display at times from MSI Afterburner, and I will explain a little bit more about that later in the video. And now let's move on to the next test. As noted before, the ROG Astral is in performance mode out of the box, and while sitting idle on the desktop, if we take a look at the average temperature and power draw, we can see that it averages around 37C and just under 16 watts. Next up, I decided to run FurMark, and I ran the 4K benchmark, and let me zoom in here so we can get a better look at the stats. This does place the ROG Astral 5080 under 100% GPU load. And as you can see, our maximum temperature is just a little bit above 63C, and the maximum power draw here is just a little over 400 watts. Next up, I ran TimeSpy Extreme, and this is a little bit contradictory to what I just showed you with FurMark. The maximum temperature here for the ROG Astral 5080 peaked at 69C, and the maximum power draw here is somehow just a little bit over 396 watts. I don't really know why there's a discrepancy in the temperatures and the power draw between the two applications, but in the spirit of full transparency, I just wanted to share the data. And now the moment at least a few of you have been waiting for, because on my unboxing video for the ROG Astral, I actually had a few people leave a comment asking me to test the ROG Astral 5080 in the Tower 300 case. And for those of you who may not know, I did a full video on my channel called Before You Buy the Tower 300. Long story short, I don't like the case. I don't recommend it. However, one of the main reasons behind that, although not the only reason, is the fact that my PNY RTX 4090 was hitting 80C in that case. Meanwhile, in a normal orientation, it ran totally fine. There was no defects with the card itself. It was purely based on the orientation inside of that case. Anyway, with that being said, that video got more attention than I expected it to get, and now I'm getting requests to test the ROG Astral specifically in that case. And even though I had to break it out of storage and it was a massive pain to rebuild in this case, I did it because you guys asked for it. So here you go. Okay, so I ran a couple of tests in the Tower 300. This is native 4K Call of Duty Black Ops 6 with the ROG Astral RTX 5080, and I did run the in-game benchmark, and this is on the ultra quality preset. And as you can see, our peak is around 61C, and it's even dipping back down to 59C at times. I can assure you with my RTX 4090 PNY, this would be 80C at this point in time. But as you see, there's several times where we dip below 60C, so the temps are looking very good. Next up is CyberPunk 2077. I ran the in-game benchmark. This is on the ray tracing ultra preset, and as you can see, we're in the 60s here, mostly around 61C, but we do temporarily peak at 63C, but then ultimately it just drops back down. Overall, the temperatures are absolutely fantastic here. The ROG Astral, even in that orientation in the Tower 300, is holding its own and performing the way that it should. And for my final test, I ran a quick benchmark in FurMark, and as you can see, we peak around 64C very temporarily, and then we drop right back down. Okay, look, I understand this is not a Tower 300 review video, and also we have a lot left to talk about in regards to the ROG Astral 5080. However, I want to give credit where credit is due, and for me personally, the Tower 300 results impressed me with the ROG Astral. They did, and that's because I have a PNY 4090 and it runs ice cold in pretty much every case I put it in except the Tower 300. So the fact that the ROG Astral was able to go in the Tower 300 and perform incredibly well from a thermal standpoint, to me, I find that impressive, and I think that's the most impressive benchmark here from a thermal testing standpoint personally. And I would have never tested that if I didn't have viewers asking for it, so thank you. And now I want to switch over and start talking about the fourth fan on the back. I understand that there were some concerns around that fan and how loud it would be. All I can do is share with you my experience and what I found to be true in my environment. Please understand, my environment is not set up to be a soundproof studio. It's not meant for acoustic testing or anything like that. So I'm not really set up to do the most accurate audio or decibel readings, if you will, but all I can do is share with you my experience. Now, real fast, my subjective experience is this. I didn't find the fourth fan to be loud. I thought it sounded totally normal and perfectly fine. I tested it in the quiet mode and the performance mode, and I didn't really see it being all that loud. I downloaded an app on my iPhone for a decibel reader, so you can already challenge how accurate that is if you want. And I made sure to turn off as many things in my room that was putting out any type of noise whatsoever, and I took a base level reading of the decibel levels in my room. And according to the Decibel app, we barely touch 30 decibels as an active reading, even for just a brief millisecond. I have no idea where the values for the average and max came from. I don't know what sets those. I don't know what resets those. Ignore those values. Just focus on the active decibel reading, and you can see we're barely touching 30 decibels. Okay, switching over to the testing for the ROG Astral, I switched the card over to the Q mode or the quiet mode, and I loaded up FurMark. And as you can see, we're hovering around 35 to 36 decibels under a full load stress test with FurMark. That's not bad at all. The highest decibel reading I saw here was 36.3 decibels. But again, this is the quiet mode. Now let's switch it over to performance mode. Okay, same test, FurMark, 100% load stress test on the ROG Astral 5080, except this time I have switched the GPU into the P mode or the performance mode, and the highest decibel reading that I saw was 46 decibels. Now again, the ROG Astral 5080 comes out of the box already overclocked, but I also did a manual overclock on top of that and really pushed it, and then I ran FurMark again, and here's my decibel reading. By the way, it's worth noting when I say I overclocked it, I mean I maxed maxed out the slider for the memory, and I maxed out the slider for the core clock and GPU tweak 3. And no, there were no crashes. Back to the FurMark testing, and now we're in performance mode with an extra added manual overclock on top of it. And the maximum decibel reading that I see here is 47.9 decibels. Now, feel free, you can criticize the testing all you want. Again, my studio is not exactly set up for that, so I did the best I could with the tools that I had. Feel free to look at the data however you see fit. But yeah, to me, I don't find the fourth fan to be all that loud. I will say if you have a 5090 Astral, there's a good chance the fan is louder because the 5090 is going to pull a lot more wattage than the 5080. And so obviously the fans will have to ramp up even more to keep it cool. So there's an argument to be made there, but I can't really speak to that because I don't have a 5090 Astral. But for me, with the 5080 Astral, the fourth fan is totally fine. Now, it is worth noting that Asus did release a BIOS update, which I didn't need or use for all of this testing. All of this testing was done prior to that. But since I've completed my testing, Asus did release a BIOS update for the ROG Astral 5080 and 5090. And you can apply this update and it will address the fan curve on the quiet mode or cube mode only. It does not impact the performance mode. It only impacts the quiet mode. And so if you have an ROG Astral and if you think the fourth fan is a little too loud, even in quiet mode, well, try the update that may fix it for you. And don't forget, you can also apply a custom fan curve. Now that's enough about the fourth fan. Let's switch over and start looking at GPU Tweak 3. And let's talk about this per pin amp sensing technology that Asus is calling Power Detector. Okay, so for those of you who may not be aware, Asus has their own dedicated GPU software called GPU Tweak 3. And with the launch of the 50 series GPUs, they have made some updates and some improvements to the software. And these updates do pair hand in hand with the 50 series cards. So for example, one of the new updates is something called a thermal map. And the idea here is very simple. Asus is claiming they have put sensors on their GPUs that allow for real-time temperature tracking of the VRMs, the chokes, and the VRAM. And honestly, I like the idea. I think it's pretty cool. It's simple. It's all in one spot. However, I would add one note here, and that is I think Asus should include labels for the temperatures so that anybody looking at it knows exactly what the temperatures are tracking. I think it's a very simple change, easy to update, something that's missing from the app, and I would like to see it added. If you scroll over to the right, you'll find another new feature called mileage. Once again, the idea here is very simple. The application is tracking your GPU usage at different power levels, and then it puts it into a pie chart, and then it divides it up between high, medium, and low. Very simple, straightforward. I gotta be honest, I'm not really sure how useful this is gonna be for somebody over time, but maybe you know, let me know in the comment section below. I will say this, when you restart your PC, the data does not reset. However, if you close the app, the data does reset. And see, with GPU Tweak 3, it automatically starts up anytime you turn on your PC. And so it fires up, and I think the idea is that you're always supposed to keep this running so that your total load tracking or mileage tracking never resets. And then your current session can constantly reset over and over so that you can see what you're currently getting versus what you have in total. I think that's the idea behind it. But like I said, if you close the application, all that data goes away and you even get a warning message for it. In addition to all of that, GPU Tweak 3 also allows for you to overclock your GPU. And it also allows for you to have an on-screen display so that you can see your frame rate and your clock speeds and all that other good stuff while you're gaming. However, I will admit this is very limited when compared to something like MSI Afterburner. Now, to be fair, GPU Tweak 3 does connect with hardware info. And so anything that GPU Tweak 3 doesn't natively have, you can kind of just pull it from hardware info. But some of my complaints about it are things you can't get from hardware info. For example, you can see your frame rate in game, but you can't see your 1% lows. You can't see your average frame rate, and you cannot see your 0.1% lows. It also has a frame time metric, but it doesn't have a frame time graph, similar to what you would see in my other benchmarks whenever I use MSI Afterburner. And finally, my last piece of constructive feedback here is simply this. You should be able to go into this on-screen display area and modify any label to say whatever you want very quickly and very easily. I went through time and time again. I even researched it online. I could find no information anywhere that suggested that I could modify these labels to say anything other than their default output. You may not care about that, but I do. I did give this feedback to Asus, and they did confirm that they are working to add additional features and functionality to GPU Tweak 3. However, with all that being said, there is a star here that shines brighter than everything else that I just talked about, and that is the Power Detector feature. This is Asus's per pin amp sensing technology. Right now, we have 5090s with melting adapters. We just came off the 40 series with 4090s that had a bunch of melting adapters, and a lot of people are very concerned because these cards are super expensive, and so you need a way to protect your investment. Well, now what Asus has done is they have given you this area where you can see every individual pin in the 12-volt high power connector, and you can see what each pin is pulling in terms of the amperage. That's awesome because it lets you know exactly what the load distribution is. In addition to that, if one of these pins is pulling too much or if something's not right, instead of seeing a green icon, you will see a red icon. In addition to that, you can also add power detector to your on-screen display and it will say normal if everything's normal. However, if there's a problem, it will then say warning. In addition to all of that, the ROG Astral also has physical protections on the GPU itself. If you do not plug in your 12-volt high power connector, or if you do not plug it in all the way properly, you will see this red LED light. This is telling you there is a problem with your connection and you should not proceed and you need to fix this. In my opinion, this is a great feature and is something that is sorely needed across the board on every GPU. Not only do we need the physical light protections, but we also need this software across the board as well. But obviously that's an Asus exclusive feature, and more specifically, it's only available on the ROG Astral. A better solution would simply be to ditch the 12-volt high power connector, but well, we all know that's not going to happen, right? Okay, this video is starting to get way too long, so I'm going to try and speed this up just a little bit. Okay, so I ran some other synthetic benchmarks. One benchmark I ran was using Davinci Resolve, and I ended up re-rendering a video that I had previously rendered with my RTX 4090. And the short version is the RTX 5080 absolutely stomped the 4090 in terms of overall processing time. This video was rendered in 4K and it's a little over 17 minutes long. And as you can see, the RTX 4090 took 8 minutes and 44 seconds to complete the render. However, the RTX 5080 was able to do it in just 4 minutes and 23 seconds. That is all thanks to the new generation of AV1 encoders that the card has. So that's definitely a benefit here. Next up, I ran the built-in benchmark in Affinity Photo, and for the most part, it does look like the RTX 4090 is still a little bit faster here, but you can see that the 5080 is very close, although the 5080 is faster in certain metrics. With that being said, any metric that uses a combined GPU, please ignore that, as that is using the iGPU from the CPU, which I forgot to disable for the 5080, but I did disable it for the 4090. Outside of that, all of the results are accurate. And now next up, I'm going to briefly talk about multi-frame generation. One of the new selling points about the 50 series cards is DLSS 4 and multi-frame generation. I will eventually revisit this topic and go into much greater detail in a later video, but for today, I'm just going to touch on it. In short, with DLSS 4, Nvidia is now introducing their brand new transformer model, which is supposed to be better than their old CNN model. And in addition to that, you now have multi-frame generation, which can do X2, X3, or X4 mode. Here is CyberPunk 2077 running at native 4K on the ray tracing ultra preset with no DLSS or frame generation enabled. And as you can see, we're just a little bit above 30 FPS. And obviously on PC, we definitely want to see frame rates much higher than that. And so that's where frame generation comes into play. Now here we have all the bells and whistles turned on. This is targeting 4K resolution, DLSS quality with multi-frame generation enabled to X4 mode, and we are using the new transformer model. And as you can see, we're just a little bit below 200 FPS. Please ignore the gameplay. I don't play CyberPunk and I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm just doing this character because I had a Patreon member request it. Now, unfortunately, the big issue with multi-frame generation is that it's not always using real rendered frames. It is using AI to generate what a lot of us call fake frames. And there are downsides to that. For example, you can see these characters in the game right here. They have some type of halo effect or ghosting effect around them. But what's even worse than that is this scene here with me on the motorcycle. At first, everything looks totally fine, but as soon as I turn my camera and look at the front of the motorcycle, you can see the wind visor is flickering back and forth, and it looks absolutely terrible. Now, the good news is most of this is software based, and so in theory, over time, Nvidia could help to patch this and make it better, and then it would just be up to the game developers to also send out the updates for each individual game. I also ended up trying out Hogwarts Legacy, and in short, I couldn't really find anything wrong specifically related to multi-frame generation. Overall, overall multi-frame generation definitely has a lot of potential, but it is far from perfect and it could definitely use some updates. And when it comes to overclocking, the ROG Astral 5080 is a beast. I was able to go into GPU Tweak 3, max out the sliders, and boom, I was off to the races. I was able to load up both Call of Duty Black Ops 6 and Assassin's Creed Mirage. I didn't have any crashes or any issues or artifacting or anything of that nature, and I was able to hit a little bit over 3.2 gigahertz. And so in short, I was very impressed with the overclocking capabilities with the ROG Astral. And when it's all said and done, I would like to make a separate video showing off overclocked benchmarks. But now it's time to get into the normal benchmarks and then try to round out this video. Okay, first of all, we have Call of Duty Black Ops 6 with the in-game built-in benchmark, 1440p on the Ultra preset. I have the 4080 Super versus the RTX 5080. And as you can see, the RTX 5080 has better 1% lows, better averages, and a better active frame rate at all times. There's about a 20 frame difference here in the average frame rate. For some reason, the 5080 is pulling in a little bit more VRAM and the clock speed is noticeably higher. And now the temperatures are about the same while the 5080 is still drawing in a little bit more power. Next up, we have Forza Horizon 5. Again, this is the built-in benchmark, 1440p on the extreme preset. This does include ray tracing, by the way. Once again, if you look at the average frame rate here, the 5080 is way ahead of the RTX 4080 Super. You're looking at an almost 40 frame difference, and you have about a 30 frame difference when you're looking at the 1% lows. And in terms of the temperatures, the 5080 is running just 3 or 4 degrees hotter than the 4080 Super, but again, the clock speed is noticeably higher, and the 5080 is also pulling in more wattage. And so when you consider all of that, the 5080 is noticeably outperforming this 4080 Super. Next up, we have God of War Ragnarok, 1440p on the Ultra preset. And when you look at the average frame rate, again, you're looking at about a 35 to 40 frame difference here, and again, about a 25 frame difference there on the 1% lows. And in terms of the temperatures, this time around, the 5080 is actually coming in colder than the 4080 Super while consuming even more power. That's crazy, and that really speaks to the capabilities of the cooling potential with the ROG Astral. Next up is Spider-Man 2, and please note that Spider-Man 2 on PC is not in the greatest condition right now, but I did have a viewer specifically request this on the unboxing video, so I did make sure to buy this and include it in the benchmarks. Anyway, this is 1440p on the very high preset, no ray tracing yet, and as you can see, the temperatures are about the same between the two GPUs, but again, the 5080 is pulling in more wattage than the 4080 Super. The 1% lows aren't really great on either GPU, but the 5080 is ahead by about 15 frames, give or take, and on the average frame rate, you're looking at about a 20 frame difference there. So the 5080 is noticeably faster than the 4080 Super. But now let's switch over and look at some ray tracing. Okay, once again, Spider-Man 2, 1440p, very high preset, except this time we do have ray tracing enabled. And the ray tracing options here are just whatever the first option is whenever you enable ray tracing. This is not maxed out. But with the 5080, you're at least able to maintain around 60 FPS on your 1% lows. And unfortunately, the 4080 Super is closer down there to about 50 FPS. And on the average frame rate, the 5080 is pushing closer to 100 FPS, while the 4080 Super is pushing closer to 80 FPS. In terms of temperatures, the 4080 Super is a little bit colder, but again, the 5080 is pulling in more wattage. Next up, we have Ratchet and Clank, 1440p on the very high preset, currently no ray tracing. And as you can see, the 5080 here is noticeably faster, especially whenever you look at those 1% lows. You're talking 107 FPS compared to 78 FPS. And the average frame rate is also noticeably higher as well. You're talking about a 40 frame difference here. And of course, the power draw is going to be higher on the 5080 as well. But the temperature is once again either matching or beating the 4080 Super here. And of course, the clock speed is noticeably faster than the 4080 Super. And now back to Ratchet and Clank, except this time is 1440p on the very high preset with ray tracing enabled and it's set to high. And again, the 5080 is faster, except the 4080 Super is very close in those 1% lows. It's not as big of a difference as you would expect. However, with the average frame rate here, you're looking about 30 FPS faster, give or take. I'm ballparking it here. And whenever you compare the temperatures, the 5080 is colder while still drawing more wattage here. And so yeah, the 5080 is actually doing a pretty good job here. And now let's switch over to 4K. Next up is CyberPunk 2077. This is native 4K with no ray tracing and no upscaling or DLSS or anything AI related. And as you can see, the 5080 has a 1% low of 57 FPS, whereas the 4080 Super Super only has about 40 FPS on the 1% lows. The average FPS for the 5080 is around 77 FPS, 78 FPS, whereas the 4080 Super is coming in at about 56 FPS. And now the 5080 is running colder while again drawing in more wattage, and the clock speed is higher. Now switching over to the Ray Tracing Ultra preset. Again, this has no AI of any kind, no upscaling, no DLSS, and this is native 4K. And neither one of these are playable experiences, and it's nothing I would brag about in either case. Yeah, the 5080 is a little bit faster here, but definitely not by much at all. Both of these cards are getting absolutely destroyed, and CyberPunk is really meant for you to take advantage of DLSS and frame generation. And now switching over to Forza Horizon 5. This is 4K on the Extreme preset. Again, this does have ray tracing built into it. And as you can see, the 5080 has an average FPS of around 161 FPS, and the 4080 Super has an average FPS of 126 FPS. And there is a noticeable difference there between the 1% lows as well. Overall, the 5080 is performing significantly better, but let's be honest, the 4080 Super is still putting up a good fight, and this is definitely more than playable for both GPUs. Next up is Spider-Man 2 on the very high preset, currently no ray tracing, and this is native 4K. And as you can see, the 1% lows here are both below 60 FPS for both GPUs, so that's not really that great. And the average frame rate for the 4080 Super is around 67, 68 FPS, whereas the 5080 seems to be holding steady at about 80 FPS. And the temperatures are more or less about the same. However, the 5080 is still clocking higher and pulling in more wattage when compared to the 4080 Super. Looking at Spider-Man 2 with ray tracing, I'm not going to hang out here too long. The frame rate is not really that great, especially the 1% lows. 1% lows are looking really bad for both cards, but both cards are coming in with an average. They're basically exactly the same here, which is very odd to me. And again, Spider-Man 2 is a game that is known to kind of be broken right now on PC. And so I'm sure this is some type of game optimization issue. Next up is Ratchet and Clank, native 4K, very high, no ray tracing. And at 4K, both cards are playable in this game. However, the 5080 has about a 20 frame advantage over the 4080 Super, and that does carry over in both the average frame rate and the 1% lows. And guys, I'm ballparking these numbers, so don't nitpick me here, please. But yeah, in terms of the temperatures, the 5080 once again is colder while pulling in more wattage and clocking higher. And for the last benchmark, we have native 4K on the very high preset with ray tracing. And yeah, both of these cards are struggling here at 4K with ray tracing. The 5080 is closer to the 60 FPS marker with the 1% lows, but not quite getting there. Meanwhile, the 4080 Super is around 44, 45 FPS. And in terms of the averages, there is about a 20 frame difference still with the average frame rate. Now, overall, the 5080 is outperforming the 4080 Super here, but again, it's one of those games I wouldn't really recommend playing at 4K with either one of these cards, unless you are planning to use DLSS or frame generation. You know, this is the part of the video where I could easily say, hey, it's up to you to decide if the price is worth it or not. Okay, have a good day, bye-bye. Or it would be very easy to say, oh, these prices are so bad, they're so stupid, yada, 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 shame on them. Okay, thank you, bye-bye. It would be so easy to say those things, and frankly, a lot of other creators do, and I'm not, you know, criticizing them. But here on my channel, I really believe in the you in YouTube, and I want you to know me. And I want to be honest with you, and I want to get to, you know, really connect with you and say, hey, let's talk like we're actually in front of each other, and let's have a real conversation about these things. I don't want to just hit the marketing points or do what I think I need to do to get you to hit like and subscribe and all that. That would be great. But I don't want to trick you into doing that, because the next time I have any type of real authenticity, you're just going to unsubscribe and leave and be mad at me, right? So let's actually have a conversation and talk like we're real human beings. So let's put things into perspective here. So we need to talk about pricing and final thoughts here. So let me break it down. Okay, so first of all, everybody was mad at me for the ROG Astral unboxing video because I didn't complain about the pricing of the card. To be fair, I didn't complain about anything of the card because, well, it wasn't yet a review. I wasn't reviewing it. I was clear about that. This is the review. This is where I have my constructive feedback. And if you have been paying attention, then you know I have been providing constructive feedback along the way. But we're here to talk about pricing, so let's talk about pricing. All right, so look, the ROG Astral initially was $1,500, which everybody viewed through the lens of that is 50% over the Nvidia Founders Edition MSRP. That's terrible. That's awful. shame on them, etc. Well, unfortunately, I got some news for you. The price has actually gone up. It's actually no longer $1,500. It is now $1,649 according to Best Buy's website. And to be fair, pretty much all the 5080s have gone up in price. In fact, I think all the GPUs in general have gone up in price. For example, the Gigabyte Aurora Master is $1,479. The MSI Gaming Trio is $1,419. The Gigabyte Gaming OC is $1,400. The MSI Supreme is $1,459. And no, I'm not just cherry picking. If you look at the Gigabyte WindForce OC, this is a bottom of the barrel card. This card was the $1,000 MSRP at launch, but now it is $1,269. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but yeah, the fact is prices have just gone up across the board. So a few weeks ago, when everybody was complaining about the prices of the cards, particularly the ROG Astral, it's only gotten worse. Now, I'm not exactly sure why that is, but my assumption is because there is still no supply. These cards are not readily available. There is at least a little bit of demand for the cards. We can debate exactly how much, but anytime demand exceeds supply, that's going to impact the pricing. And then you still have scalpers, which never help anything. And here in North America, we do have an administration that is implementing tariffs, and tariffs do have an impact. I'm not getting political. That's all I'm going to say about it. But the fact is, there are tariffs, they do exist, and they do have an impact. And how much of an impact, I don't know. That's up for debate. So those are all the different factors, and that's the only thing I can think of that would justify all the cards getting slightly more expensive or really more expensive. I don't like these prices. I know you don't like these prices. I know some people look at me and say, well, you got a card, for free for review. You're good. Everything's good for you. Well, that's not exactly true. I have friends, I have family members. They have asked me to build them PCs. I got people that I want to build a PC for. I still have to go get them GPUs, guys. And in case you haven't noticed, Nvidia has completely discontinued the 40 series cards. And that's really where everything kind of comes to a halt. You see, here's the thing. Everybody this entire time has been doing two things, and they're both wrong. Number one, everybody compares the 50 series cards to the 40 series cards as if the 40 series cards are a viable option. They're not. Nvidia discontinued the 40 series cards months ago, and now you can no longer buy them for retail pricing. They're not available. So your best bet is to get them from, the secondhand used market. The problem with that is everybody understands we're basically living in 2020 all over again because no GPUs are available. So everybody is jacking up the prices. You should be able to get a 4080 or a 4080 Super, for example, in the secondhand marketplace for $700-800, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. But instead, people are selling them for a lot more than that. And that sucks, but they know they can get away with it because nobody else has any other viable options, right? Now, the second issue is everybody takes the AIC or add-in card partners, like the ROG Astral, for example, and they compare that to the Founders Edition model. And in the grand scheme of things, all that's going to do is make you mad and drive you crazy because you're comparing two things that, one, aren't really meant to be compared, and two, the Founders Edition model for $1,000, it doesn't really exist. No other card is going for $1,000 right now. Only the Founders Edition model is listed at that price. And Nvidia cannot keep it in stock, or they won't keep it in stock, one or the other. Either way, it's not in stock. It could be $5 for all I care. What does it matter if you can't buy it? You see what I'm saying? So now your only viable options are cards that are hundreds of dollars over MSRP. And so if that's your only option, then you can't really compare the ROG Astral or the Aurora Master or the MSI Gaming Trio to the Founders Edition model and then complain when they're hundreds of dollars over MSRP. You're comparing it to something that Nvidia is not honoring. Nvidia is not fulfilling. Nvidia has told you something that is not true. They have told you that the 5080 is $1,000, and it's not. It's just not. For whatever reason, it is not. And so really what you have to do is you have to compare all the AIC models to each other. And yes, I understand. If you compare the ROG Astral to any other 5080, it is still the most expensive 5080. And that's where you get into the nuances of things, right? That's where you can say, okay, is it worth it to pay a little more to have this feature or that feature? And that's where you can start to evaluate things, right? And look, let me be very clear about this. Going back to MSRP, in 2 days, the 5070 Ti will launch to the public. And when it launches to the public, it is supposed to be $750. However, by now, I'm sure we've all seen the Micro Center leaks. These cards are not going to be $750. These cards are going to be $900 or more in some cases. And so literally, you will have people purchasing a 5070 Ti for just about the same price that you are supposed to pay for a 5080. Think about that. That is how bad things have gotten. There is no MSRP here. All the prices that Nvidia have been putting out there and claiming, none of it is true. It doesn't exist. It's not real. And that's really where the problem is here. And now with all that being said, let me close out with the ROG Astral specifically. Here's what I can tell you. I would love to give it a glowing recommendation and tell everybody, hey, this card's amazing, you should buy it. But there are a few cold hard truths about it. Number one, it's sold out. I don't even see it available anywhere. Number two, it is now $1,650, and that's not cheap. That is very expensive. And my 4090, I paid $1,599 for it before tax. And my 4090 is still technically faster than the 5080, right? Now, the ROG Astral is a much better built GPU all the way around, but my 4090 that I paid $1,600 for is, still faster. So there's that aspect of it. It is a very expensive GPU, guys, and it's very hard to justify the cost. What I can say is this: Asus understands that it is a premium product and they are going after a niche premium crowd with the ROG Astral. For other gamers who are looking for more affordable options, they have the Prime series and the Tough Gaming series. But for the people, wanting the best of the best, so to speak, that's where the ROG Astral comes in. And, we can get into the nuances of, well, how does this card compare to that? I will say this: in my personal experience using the ROG Astral, I had 0 issues, 0 crashes. What I was personally most impressed with was the thermals of the ROG Astral. I mean, the card is just amazing in terms of thermal capabilities. But after that, I was also very impressed with the overclocking capabilities. I maxed out the sliders. I didn't have any crashes. Nothing broke on me. And I tried 3 different games and they all booted just fine, and I was able to run the in-game benchmarks. I have more benchmarks that did not make it in this video because this video is so long. But yes, Call of Duty ran no problem. CyberPunk ran no problem. Assassin's Creed Mirage ran no problem. I'm not used to seeing that whenever I'm tinkering with GPUs and overclocking them. So yes, the overclocking capabilities of the Astral are truly phenomenal. And the build quality is great, and the per pin amp sensing technology I think is probably one of a kind. I don't think anybody else is doing anything like that. And so look, overall, in terms of the card itself, Asus did a rock solid job with the card. It is absolutely phenomenal. With that being said, it's very expensive, and therefore it's hard to recommend. Asus knows that. They are going for a niche premium crowd here. And at the end of the day, it is still a 5080. But what I will say, because I already see the comments, 16 gigabytes, that's not an Asus decision. Again, that's an Nvidia decision. There's a lot here to be mad at Nvidia about. So it is still 16 gigabytes, and that is something that's going to be a stain on it. It just is. But with that being said, if you're going to get a 5080, this might not be the only 5080 worth considering, but it might just be the best. I'm open to talking about it in the comment section below. Keep in mind, this is the only 5080 I have access to, so I haven't had the opportunity to play around with any other 5080 to make an accurate comparison. With that being said, that's all I got for this video. My voice is about to go out. I've been recording for 12 hours. I need to go. All right. Thank you for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, all the things. And until next time, E-Rock out.